9 years of marriage with Emma had been Jacob's anchor, or so he thought. As a Kamaz truck driver, long stretches on the road were his routine. But he always carried the image of home, a tidy house, a warm dinner, and Emma's smile waiting at the door. It made the endless highways bearable. That routine cracked one crisp autumn evening. Jacob arrived home a day earlier than expected, hoping to surprise Emma. Instead, it was he who was blindsided. A Kamaz truck, unfamiliar and haphazardly parked, sat in the driveway. Jacob paused, his pulse quickening. Maybe it belonged to a neighbor or a friend, though the knot tightening in his stomach suggested otherwise. The house was eerily quiet as he stepped inside. The lights were dim, and there was no warm greeting. Instead, muffled sounds filtered through the walls, coming from the kitchen. Jacob's steps quickened, his mind racing through 1,000 explanations, none of them comforting. And then there it was, the truth laid bare. Emma stood by the kitchen table, her face flushed, hair disheveled. She wore only a top and her underwear. Beside her, a burly man scrambled to pull on his pants, his face a mixture of shock and fear. Time seemed to freeze. The air was thick with unspoken words. Jacob stared, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists. He didn't yell or demand answers. His silence was heavier than any words he could have spoken. Emma began to stammer, her eyes wide with panic, but Jacob raised his hand, a signal for her to stop. His eyes burned into hers, devoid of the warmth they once held. He turned on his heel and walked out, the screen door slamming behind him. Outside, Jacob leaned against his truck, his breathing ragged. The betrayal was a weight he couldn't yet fully grasp. He wanted to cry, to scream, to smash something. But instead, he focused on the other Kamaz. Retrieving a container of gasoline from his truck storage, he moved with grim determination. Moments later, the stranger's vehicle was engulfed in flames, the fire roaring like the rage in Jacob's chest. He didn't flinch as the flames licked higher, illuminating the night. Inside, Emma's voice called out, desperate and pleading. Jacob didn't turn back. Let her deal with the mess she'd made. The acrid smell of burning rubber still lingered in the air as Jacob climbed into his own truck, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. He wasn't sure where he was going, only that he needed to escape the suffocating betrayal. But before he could even start the engine, the door to the house burst open. Emma ran out barefoot, her hair still a mess, tears streaming down her face. Jacob! Wait! She cried, her voice cracking. She reached the side of his truck, banging on the door. He opened the window slightly but didn't say a word, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Please, just listen to me, Emma pleaded, her voice desperate. It's not what you think. He was just a friend who needed help, and things got out of hand. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he still said nothing. His silence unnerved her. Emma leaned against the truck, clutching the window frame like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I was lonely, Jacob. You're always gone. I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't even want it to. He kept pushing, and I made a mistake. A stupid, meaningless mistake. Her words were a cascade of excuses, each one digging the hole deeper. Jacob finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might speak, but instead, he rolled up the window and started the engine. Emma stepped back, her sobs echoing in the quiet night as Jacob drove away. Jacob didn't go far. He parked at a nearby overlook, the town's lights twinkling below like a world he no longer belonged to. He sat in the cab, replaying her words over and over. A mistake. A friend. How many lies could she stack on top of each other before they collapsed under their own weight? He thought of their life together, the nights he spent on the road, thinking of her, missing her. He'd worked tirelessly to provide for their simple but comfortable life. And this was how she repaid him. The betrayal was bad enough, but the lies were what twisted the knife. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was Emma. She'd been calling non-stop since he left. He didn't answer. The calls stopped for a moment, replaced by a flood of text messages. Apologies, excuses, more lies thinly veiled as explanations. He couldn't stomach reading them and tossed the phone aside. When Jacob finally returned home hours later, the Kamaz he'd set ablaze was reduced to a charred husk, the flames long extinguished. Emma was sitting on the front steps, wrapped in a blanket, her face streaked with tears. She jumped to her feet as he approached but hesitated when she saw the coldness in his eyes. I know you hate me, she said, her voice small. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. Jacob didn't respond. He brushed past her, stepping into the house that suddenly felt foreign. He ignored her voice as she followed him, trying to explain, to justify. Her words were a mix of guilt and self-pity, each one angrier and more desperate than the last. "I was just lonely, Jacob. You're never here. Do you know how hard it is to be alone all the time?" she shouted, her tone shifting to anger when her pleas didn't seem to reach him. He turned to her finally, his face etched with exhaustion and pain. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through her rambling like a knife. "I trusted you, Emma. And you threw it all away." Her expression crumbled, but Jacob didn't stay to see her next excuse. He went to the bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think. Her lies echoed in his head, taunting him. He knew she wasn't done trying to manipulate him. And he wasn't done uncovering the depths of her betrayal. The next morning, Jacob woke to the faint sound of Emma moving around the house. It was as if she were trying to return to normal, tidying up as though cleaning could erase what had happened. He remained in the bedroom for a long time, staring at the walls, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions that churned inside him. Anger, betrayal, sadness. It all came in waves, threatening to pull him under. By the time he stepped into the living room, Emma was seated at the dining table, her eyes red from crying. She looked up at him, her face hopeful but hesitant, like she was waiting for permission to speak. "I want to fix this," she said softly. "I made a mistake, but I know we can get through it." Jacob didn't answer. Instead, he walked past her and out the door, heading toward the remains of the other Kamaz truck. The sight of its charred frame brought back the surge of rage he had felt the night before, but now it was tempered with cold determination. He wasn't just going to stand by and let this slide. He had been faithful, loyal, and patient for 9 years. Emma needed to understand what it felt like to lose everything. Jacob began planning his next steps with the methodical precision he used in his trucking career. He didn't yell or argue with Emma anymore. She didn't deserve his energy. Instead, he focused on dismantling the life they had built together, brick by brick. The first thing he did was head to the bank. Their joint accounts, savings, and everything tied to his name were wiped clean and moved to a new account under his sole ownership. Emma wouldn't notice immediately. She rarely looked at the finances since Jacob had always managed them. By the time she realized what was happening, it would be too late. Later that day, while Emma was out of the house, likely meeting with a friend to gather sympathy, Jacob made his next move. He went through their home, gathering every document, receipt, and legal paper he could find. Marriage certificates, house deeds, insurance policies, anything that tied her to him. He locked it all in a box and stowed it in his truck. She wouldn't have access to any of it when the time came. He thought about the pharmacy where Emma worked. It was a small town, and he knew enough people to pull some strings. He didn't want to be vindictive, but then he remembered the look on her face when she stood there with another man, unashamed. She deserved to feel the weight of her actions. A few phone calls later, whispers began circulating about Emma's conduct, rumors strong enough to cast doubt on her professionalism. He didn't need to do much. Word traveled fast in a place like theirs. When Jacob returned home, Emma was there, her face drawn with worry. She had noticed the locked cabinet where they kept their important documents and the missing items in their bedroom. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Are you trying to punish me? Is that it?" Jacob met her gaze, unflinching. He didn't raise his voice or try to explain himself. She didn't deserve an explanation. The silence spoke for him. "You can't just take everything, Jacob. This is our life, our home," she shouted. But her words rang hollow. She had already taken everything that mattered when she broke his trust. Emma's anger quickly shifted to desperation. She begged him to stop, pleaded with him to let her prove she could change. But Jacob wasn't interested in her theatrics. He walked past her again, leaving her standing in the middle of the living room, her hands trembling. That night, Jacob sat on the porch with a bottle of whiskey, watching the sun set over the town. The wind carried the faint sound of Emma crying inside the house, but he felt no sympathy. She had turned their life into a lie, and now he was going to make sure she faced the consequences. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, Jacob knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. The days that followed were a surreal blur for Jacob. He moved through his routines like a ghost, hollowed out by the betrayal but fueled by an unrelenting sense of purpose. Every action he took was deliberate, calculated. Meanwhile, Emma seemed to unravel further with each passing day. She hovered around him constantly, her once confident demeanor replaced by jittery desperation. Her attempts to talk to him grew increasingly frantic, shifting between anger, guilt, and self-pity. "I know I hurt you," she said one evening, her voice breaking as Jacob sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his untouched dinner. "But I've apologized 1,000 times. What more do you want from me?" Jacob didn't respond. He had no intention of giving her the satisfaction of closure. She had taken everything from him: the trust, the stability, the life they had spent nearly a decade building together. Words wouldn't fix that. Emma wasn't ready to give up. She followed him around the house, alternating between begging for forgiveness and accusing him of overreacting. "You're being cruel," she said one night as Jacob packed a bag in the bedroom. "I made one mistake, a single mistake, and you're throwing everything away? 9 years. Jacob. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" Jacob zipped the bag and turned to face her. His eyes were cold, his face devoid of any emotion. "It meant everything to me," he said simply before walking out. Emma's persistence didn't stop there. She started calling Jacob's family, trying to rally support, painting herself as a victim of his cold-heartedness. But Jacob had already beaten her to it. He had spoken to his parents and siblings, laying out the truth in stark detail. Emma's betrayal was so blatant, so undeniable, that even her most sympathetic attempts fell flat. When Emma realized she couldn't sway his family, she turned to mutual friends. They received tearful calls and carefully crafted messages, all designed to garner their pity. But again, Jacob had anticipated this. He shared just enough of the truth with their closest friends to ensure they wouldn't be swayed by Emma's performance. The pressure started to break her. One afternoon, Jacob found her sitting on the couch, clutching her phone, her face streaked with tears. She looked up at him as he entered, her expression a mix of despair and frustration. "I don't know what you want me to do," she said quietly. "Do you want me to leave? To disappear? Tell me, Jacob. I'll do anything." Jacob leaned against the doorframe, studying her. He could see the cracks in her facade, the woman who had once been so confident, so self-assured, now reduced to this. It should have brought him some satisfaction, but it didn't. It only underscored how much damage she had done to both of them. Without a word, Jacob turned and walked away. He wasn't ready to give her an answer. Not yet. Emma's pleas would have to wait, just like the truth had waited for him all those months she had lied. Let her sit with the silence. Jacob didn't rush his decisions. He let them simmer. Emma's betrayal wasn't just a fleeting act, it had been a deliberate choice, one that deserved consequences she couldn't easily escape. And Jacob was a man who knew how to play the long game. He spent the following days putting his plan into action. While Emma continued her desperate attempts to regain his favor, Jacob worked behind the scenes, dismantling her life piece by piece. The first step was her job at the pharmacy. Jacob called in a favor from an old friend who worked with the local business council. He didn't need to exaggerate. The truth of her infidelity, coupled with her recent erratic behavior, was enough to raise eyebrows. Soon, Emma found herself called into an unexpected meeting with her manager. She came home that evening in tears, clutching a termination notice. "They said I've been unreliable lately," she sobbed, pacing the living room. "That my reputation is causing problems. But it's not fair, Jacob. I've always been good at my job." Jacob sat silently in his armchair, sipping his coffee, as though her words were background noise. He felt no guilt. Emma had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. Next, Jacob turned his attention to their shared finances. While Emma had been too distracted to notice, he had already secured control over their accounts, locking her out of their savings and credit lines. The realization hit her one morning when she attempted to pay for groceries and her card was declined. She stormed into the house later, her face flushed with anger. "Why is my account frozen? Did you do this?" she demanded, waving the receipt in front of him. Jacob didn't even look up from the paper he was reading. "Joint accounts mean joint decisions," he said flatly. "And I've decided I don't want to share anymore." Emma's face crumpled, and for a moment, Jacob thought she might lash out. But instead, she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "You're punishing me," she whispered. "You're trying to ruin my life." Jacob finally looked at her, his expression unyielding. "No, Emma. You did that yourself." As word of Emma's affair spread through their small town, her social circle began to shrink. Friends who once welcomed her with open arms now kept their distance. The Kamaz driver she'd been involved with had fled town, unwilling to face the fallout. Emma was left alone, ostracized and humiliated. But Jacob wasn't done. He decided to sell the house, a symbol of the life they had built together, now tarnished beyond repair. He contacted a realtor and began the process quietly, knowing it would catch Emma off guard. When she finally discovered his plans, her reaction was explosive. "You can't sell this house," she yelled, standing in the middle of the living room as Jacob packed a box of his belongings. "This is my home too." Jacob paused, turning to face her. "It stopped being a home the moment you invited someone else into it." Emma was left speechless. For all her manipulation, all her attempts to regain control, Jacob's resolve was unshakable. The house would be sold, and she would have no claim to the profits. It was another step toward cutting her out of his life entirely. That night, Jacob sat in the truck parked in the driveway, staring at the darkened house. It was no longer the place he had imagined spending the rest of his life. It was a hollow shell, like the marriage it once represented. As he started the engine and drove off into the night, he felt a weight begin to lift. Emma's world was crumbling, and soon, he would be free to leave her behind for good. The ripples of Emma's affair spread through their small town like wildfire. Jacob knew people would talk. It was unavoidable in a place where everyone knew each other's business. But what surprised him was how quickly public opinion turned against Emma. At the local diner, whispers followed her every move. Regulars who once greeted her warmly now avoided eye contact, their conversations cutting off mid-sentence as she entered. The betrayal wasn't just a scandal. It was seen as a breach of trust that many in the community couldn't forgive. Emma had built a reputation as a kind, dependable figure at the pharmacy. Now, that image was shattered. Customers and colleagues began recounting interactions that, in hindsight, seemed suspicious or self-serving. People she thought of as allies distanced themselves, leaving her isolated. Jacob, on the other hand, found himself unexpectedly supported. Fellow truckers, neighbors, even casual acquaintances reached out to him. They shared drinks, offered words of encouragement, and made it clear that they were firmly on his side. One evening, as Jacob sat at the bar nursing a beer, a man he barely knew, a mechanic who worked on local trucks, approached him. "Look, Jacob," the man said, pulling up a stool. "I don't know how you're keeping it together, but I respect it. If there's anything you need, a favor, a ride, whatever, you just let me know." Jacob nodded, touched by the gesture but too drained to respond with more than a brief thanks. The outpouring of support didn't heal the betrayal, but it reminded him that he wasn't alone. Emma's isolation deepened when mutual friends began to choose sides. At first, a few tried to mediate, urging Jacob to hear her out, to consider reconciliation. But Jacob stood firm, laying out the facts in his calm, measured way. As he recounted Emma's actions, her lies, her disregard for their marriage, it became clear to everyone that there was no path back. The friend group fractured. Those who sided with Emma did so quietly, reluctant to defend her too publicly. Most, however, aligned with Jacob, offering him their sympathy and support. Even people who had once admired Emma's charm and friendliness admitted they couldn't condone what she had done. Emma began to crumble under the weight of the town's judgment. One afternoon, Jacob returned to the house to find her sitting on the porch, her shoulders slumped, her eyes hollow. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mix of exhaustion and defeat. "Do you even care what people are saying about me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob stopped at the foot of the steps, meeting her gaze with a steady calm. "Did you care what I'd feel when you invited him into our home?" he replied. Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. For the first time, Jacob felt a pang of pity, but it was fleeting. Her tears couldn't undo the damage. That night, Jacob sat in the quiet of his truck, staring out at the darkened streets. The town's collective disapproval had done what he couldn't. It stripped away Emma's facade, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions. It wasn't revenge. Not entirely. It was justice. Emma's behavior grew more erratic as the weight of her isolation pressed down on her. Each passing day seemed to chip away at the confident, composed woman she once was. She spent hours pacing the house, muttering to herself, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as if it were a lifeline. Jacob watched her spiral with a detached sense of inevitability. It was only a matter of time before she tried to claw her way back into the good graces of those around her. And she started with their mutual friends. Emma began crafting a narrative, painting herself as the victim of neglect, loneliness, and emotional abandonment. To anyone who would listen, she blamed Jacob's demanding job, claiming that his long stretches away from home had left her feeling unloved and forgotten. "He was never here," she said to one mutual friend over coffee, her eyes brimming with carefully rehearsed tears. "I felt invisible. I know what I did was wrong, but can you really blame me for wanting to feel seen?" Some friends listened sympathetically, nodding along as Emma poured out her grievances. But as they dug deeper into the story, it became clear she was omitting key details. Details Jacob had already shared with them. Her excuses rang hollow, and her attempt to shift blame only fueled their growing skepticism. One evening, Jacob received a text from a close friend, Brian. "Just had a chat with Emma," it read. "Thought you should know she's making the rounds, trying to drum up sympathy. Don't worry, we're not buying it." Jacob stared at the message for a long moment, his jaw tightening. He had anticipated this move from Emma, but it still stung. The betrayal was bad enough without her attempting to rewrite history. Emma's next tactic was more direct. She began showing up at the homes of mutual friends unannounced, pleading for their understanding. Her desperation was palpable, her voice tinged with a manic energy that made some uncomfortable. She told anyone who would listen that Jacob was being vindictive, punishing her far beyond what she deserved. "He's turned everyone against me," she sobbed during one such visit. "I made a mistake, yes, but I'm not a monster. Can't you see how cruel he's being?" But her efforts had the opposite effect. The more she tried to manipulate others, the clearer it became how deep her betrayal ran. Friends began to pull away, unwilling to be caught in the web of half-truths and self-pity she was spinning. Jacob stayed silent through it all, letting her flounder. He didn't need to counter her narrative, her actions spoke for themselves. And as more people distanced themselves from her, Emma's desperation grew. One evening, she cornered Jacob in the kitchen, her eyes wild with frustration. "Why are you doing this to me?" she demanded. "You're ruining my life." Jacob set down the coffee cup he'd been holding and turned to face her. "I'm not doing anything," he said calmly. "You're the one who made your choices. Now you're just dealing with the consequences." Emma's lips trembled, and for a moment, Jacob thought she might lash out. But instead, she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Her footsteps echoed through the house as she retreated to the bedroom, leaving Jacob standing alone. That night, Jacob lay awake in bed, listening to the faint sound of Emma crying in the next room. He felt no satisfaction, no vindication, only a hollow sense of finality. She had brought this on herself, and no amount of tears or excuses could change that. The tension between Jacob and Emma came to a head on a stormy evening, the rain hammering against the windows like a drumroll leading to an inevitable climax. Jacob was sitting in the living room, going through documents for the sale of the house. The place felt emptier than ever, stripped of the warmth it once held. Emma's footsteps echoed in the hallway before she appeared in the doorway, her face pale and resolute. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm despite the trembling in her hands. Jacob set down the papers and leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Go ahead." Emma stepped into the room, clutching the back of a chair as though it might keep her upright. "I know you hate me," she began, her tone wavering. "And I know I've made mistakes. Terrible ones. But we've been through so much together. 9 years. Jacob. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" Jacob watched her in silence, his face a mask of calm. "It meant everything to me," he said finally. "Until you threw it all away." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she pressed on. "I was lonely, Jacob. You were gone all the time. I felt like I didn't matter to you anymore." And he was there, saying all the things I needed to hear. Jacob's jaw tightened. "Don't try to justify it. You had a choice, Emma. And you chose to betray me." Her voice rose, frustration overtaking her sorrow. "Do you think I wanted this? To hurt you? To destroy everything we built? I made a mistake. A stupid, horrible mistake. But I didn't do it because I stopped loving you." Jacob stood, towering over her as he spoke. "You didn't stop loving me? Is that supposed to make it better? You lied to me, Emma. You brought another man into our home, into our life. Do you even understand what you've done?" Emma shrank back, tears streaming down her face. "I'm begging you, Jacob. Give me a chance to make it right. I'll do anything." Jacob shook his head slowly, his voice heavy with finality. "It's too late. The trust is gone. The life we had, it's gone. You can't undo that." For a moment, Emma seemed to crumple under the weight of his words. But then her desperation morphed into defiance. "So that's it? You're just going to walk away? After everything we've been through?" Jacob's gaze was steady. "You walked away first, Emma. I'm just following your lead." She stared at him, her face a mix of anger, grief, and disbelief. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed out of the room, her footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. Jacob remained where he was, staring at the papers on the table. The confrontation had left him drained, but it also brought a sense of closure. For the first time since discovering her betrayal, he felt a glimmer of peace. He had said what needed to be said, and now it was time to move on. The storm outside raged on, but inside, Jacob felt the faintest hint of calm. The storm in his life was finally beginning to subside. The day Jacob had been waiting for finally arrived. A clear morning, the kind that hinted at new beginnings. The house, now empty and stripped of its memories, stood silent as Jacob loaded the last of his belongings into his truck. Emma wasn't there. She had moved out a few days earlier, her departure marked by quiet resignation and a single note left on the kitchen counter. "I'm sorry for everything. I hope you find peace." Jacob didn't respond to the note. What was there to say? He wasn't angry anymore. The rage that had fueled him in the early days of her betrayal had burned itself out, leaving behind a quieter determination to start over. The sale of the house had gone through without a hitch. Jacob ensured Emma wouldn't see a dime from the profits, every detail meticulously planned to exclude her. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about severing ties completely. This chapter of his life needed to end, cleanly and decisively. As Jacob stood in the empty driveway, he looked back at the house one last time. It didn't feel like home anymore. It hadn't since that fateful night when he walked in and found everything he thought he knew about his life unraveling before his eyes. Letting it go didn't feel like a loss. It felt like freedom. He climbed into his Kamaz, the cab packed with his few remaining possessions. The engine roared to life, the sound a welcome reminder of the road ahead. Jacob had spent years driving endless highways, but this journey felt different. This wasn't just another haul. It was the start of something new. As he pulled out of the driveway, Jacob thought about where he would go. He had no clear destination in mind, but that didn't bother him. For the first time in a long while, he felt untethered, unbound by the weight of expectations or obligations. The possibilities stretched out before him like the open road. The town disappeared in his rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills and endless sky. Jacob allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about the life he had left behind, the love that had once seemed unshakable, the trust that had been shattered. It would have been easy to let bitterness consume him, but Jacob had made a choice, to let go. He would build a new life, one grounded in honesty and resilience. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready to face it. With each mile he drove, the pain of the past grew a little fainter, replaced by a growing sense of hope. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob felt something he hadn't felt in months: peace. He was finally free. Jacob's journey didn't have a defined destination, and for the first time, that felt like a blessing. The open road was his escape, a place where he could let the miles and the steady rumble of the Kamaz dissolve the weight of the past. Each sunrise brought him closer to something he couldn't quite define but knew he needed: a fresh start. He eventually found himself in a small, quiet town nestled between rolling hills and endless fields. It wasn't much different from the town he'd left behind, but it felt untainted, like a blank page waiting to be written on. Jacob parked his Kamaz at a diner on the edge of town, the scent of coffee and grilled bacon wafting through the air as he stepped inside. The waitress, a cheerful woman in her 40s with kind eyes, greeted him warmly. "You new around here, stranger?" she asked. Jacob nodded, offering a faint smile. "Just passing through," he replied. But as he sat at the counter, sipping his coffee and listening to the quiet hum of the diner, he felt a strange pull. Maybe this was a place he could stay, even if just for a while. Over the next few weeks, Jacob began to settle in. He found a small apartment above a hardware store and took on a job at a local trucking company. The work was familiar, grounding. The town's pace was slower than he was used to, but that suited him just fine. People here didn't pry. They greeted him with friendly nods and polite smiles but didn't ask questions about his past. It was a relief to exist without the shadow of his old life looming over him. One afternoon, while making a delivery to a nearby farm, Jacob met Claire, a single mother who managed the property with quiet determination. She was nothing like Emma. There was no pretense, no manipulation in her demeanor. She greeted Jacob with a firm handshake and a smile that reached her eyes. "Need a hand with that?" she asked, nodding toward the heavy crates Jacob was unloading. He chuckled softly. "I think I've got it, but thanks." Over time, their paths crossed more often. Claire's farm became a regular delivery spot, and their conversations grew longer, more personal. She talked about her son, her dreams of expanding the farm, and the struggles of doing it all on her own. Jacob found himself drawn to her honesty and strength. It wasn't long before Claire invited Jacob to dinner at the farmhouse. The meal was simple: roast chicken, fresh vegetables, and warm bread, but it felt more meaningful than any meal Jacob had shared in years. As they talked and laughed over glasses of wine, Jacob felt a warmth he hadn't realized he was missing. Claire didn't pry into his past, but when he finally opened up about Emma and the betrayal that had driven him to start over, she listened without judgment. "Sounds like you've been through hell," she said softly. "But you're here now. And that says a lot." Jacob nodded, her words settling over him like a bomb. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just running from his past. He was running toward a future he hadn't dared to hope for. The months rolled by, and Jacob found himself building something new. Not just with Claire, but with the town itself. He became a familiar face at the diner, a trusted worker at the trucking company, and a friend to the locals who once saw him as a stranger. Life wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that was enough for Jacob. The pain of Emma's betrayal would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He had found his footing on the other side of heartbreak, and for the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. As the sun set over the hills one evening, Jacob sat on the porch of Claire's farmhouse, her son playing in the yard. Claire joined him, handing him a glass of iced tea. "Think you'll stay a while?" she asked, her tone light but hopeful. Jacob looked out at the horizon, the colors of the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He smiled softly. "Yeah," he said. "I think I will."